Merry Christmas, written by USA Today bestselling author Lexi Timms, copyright 2023 by Lexi Timms, narrated by Kathleen Starr Hall. Chapter 9, December 9th. Coulson tossed the manual for the plastic Christmas tree aside. He didn't need instructions. They were confusing anyway. He'd figure this out. First, he'd put the tree together, then figure out what he wanted to decorate it with. Bracing himself against one of the shelves in the living room, he ripped the box open and started pulling out the pieces of the plastic tree. This was going to be a piece of cake. He just had to remember not to put too much stress on his back. His early morning jog today had been good. No twinges of pain. He'd like to keep it that way. The doorbell went off. His chest tightened. She was here. He'd been anticipating her arrival all day, and now that she was finally here, Coulson felt weirdly nervous. Maybe because he'd never decorated in his life, and how he was going to be starting out a new tradition with her. Who knew making an attempt at holiday cheer could be so stressful? He set the box down and stepped out of the living room to let her inside. She was so breathtaking that it felt like his heart actually stopped for a moment. Blair seemed to glow, her loose blonde curls creating a halo effect around her head. Her cheeks were flushed pink, and her warm brown eyes lit up when she saw him. "You're here." The moment he said it, Coulson wanted to wince, because it was stating something so obvious that he must have sounded like an idiot. What he wanted was to sound smooth, the way he usually did when he was pursuing a woman. But his heart was pounding so loudly that he was too distracted to remember how to be smooth. All he could manage was to remember that he was the host and she was the guest. He'd been raised properly enough to remember his damn manners, even if seeing her was making him sweat. "Come on in," he said, motioning to her. "Thanks for inviting me," she said, stepping into the house. "What room are you going to decorate?" "Living room," he said. "I'm the only one staying here at the moment, but it's the one room visitors get to see, so I figured I'd decorate it." "It makes sense," she said, following him into the living room. "Have you settled on a theme?" He arched an eyebrow. "Theme?" "Well, sometimes people decorate according to a theme. I was looking up ideas on one of those Imagine sharing sites, and there's all kinds of Christmas decor on there." She started counting off on her fingers as she explained. There was a nautical-themed one, which honestly doesn't make much sense for a mountain town like Mislin Bush. But I saw a farmhouse theme, some minimalist designs, a Victorian-era-themed one. Oh, there was one where you make the decorations by hand. So there were a lot of paper decorations. She must have caught the look of confusion on his face because she gave an apologetic smile. "Sorry, got way ahead of myself. I should remember this is your first opportunity to decorate, so we can keep it simple." "Right. Already got the tree out of the box," he said, gesturing to the pieces of the plastic tree scattered across the carpeted floor. "Oh, you decided on a plastic tree," she observed, getting down on her knees beside the pieces. "That's what I use at my apartment." "Really?" he asked, relieved that she wasn't judging him for going with plastic. He'd wondered if she would consider that sacrilege or something. "Yeah, my brothers and I gather at our dad's place, and since he has a real tree, I just go with a plastic tree every year," she explained. "It beats having to sweep up pine needles." "Right, that makes sense," he said. Until her comment, Coulson hadn't seriously considered all the work that went into decorating for the holidays. The servants were the ones who made the Bennett family residences run like clockwork, while his luxury apartment went without any decorations since he decided against having a bunch of servants. The family home where his parents lived always looked like something out of a magazine. Hell, some years they actually did end up in architectural magazines to show off the decorating they'd paid for and never put up themselves. His mother loved to pretend she was the one who set up everything, when the reality was that a fleet of servants made the family home look that way. Though his family always insisted on paying their servants good wages, mostly to brag about their own generosity, he had definitely taken their hard work for granted over the years. He'd known it had taken effort, but there were minute details that he hadn't even thought of, like sweeping up pine needles. Blair was already rolling up her sleeves to begin putting the base of the tree together. He got down on the floor beside her, and between the two of them, they had the plastic tree up in 20 minutes. "Looking good," she said, taking a step back to admire the tree. "Now, we need to get this near an electrical outlet." Amazing how that hadn't even occurred to him. "There's one by the window," he said, grabbing onto the tree. Under Blair's watchful eye, he got the tree set up by the outlet near the living room window. Okay, we can put the lights up now, she said. On it. He went to the coffee table to pick up the boxes of Christmas lights he'd gotten from the hardware store. Do you usually set the lights up first? He asked as he approached her. Yep. She took a box from him to open it. Lights first, then ornaments. Her face was set with an intense concentration that made her adorable. Blair's eyes narrowed slightly as she removed the string of lights from the box, her teeth worrying her lower lip as she worked. The truth was, he could watch her do anything, no matter how mundane. Coulson couldn't take his eyes off her, and she must have noticed him staring because she said, Why didn't you get that second box open? That got him out of his love-struck trance. Sure, no problem. Soon, both sets of Christmas lights were out of the box, and Coulson connected them. We should test them out to make sure they work, she said, putting the plug in the outlet. Scores of white lights came on, eliciting a smile from her. Incredible how something as simple as lights working could bring a smile to her face. Coulson made a mental note of it because he wanted to learn the things that brought her joy. They work, she said excitedly. Pretty clever testing them out first, he said. Well, I keep lights over several years, so sometimes they do go out, she explained. It's the worst when you forget to test them and then get them around the tree only to find out that they've burned out. Within minutes, they were winding the connected strings around the tree. As they wrapped the string, he couldn't help stealing glances at her, watching her as she focused all of her energy into helping. That adorable look on her face, her hands working expertly while he, by contrast, was a clumsy oaf in comparison. His hands bumped into hers more than once, and she blushed every time. Once, their fingers accidentally laced together, and he heard her breath hitch at the contact, her chest heaving when their eyes met. Sorry, he said quickly. It's okay, she said, pulling her hands away so slowly he could swear that meant she was reluctant to release her hold on him. Finally, the lights were wrapped around the tree, and Blair put the plug in the outlet. The tree lit up, scores of white lights twinkling between the branches. What do you think? She asked. Looks terrific, he said. Like a department store tree. Doesn't it? Blair paused to admire the tree. It's so festive and pretty. His heart warmed seeing her so happy. Coulson hadn't realized that decorating could actually bring joy to people. If he had known, he might have done this years ago. What's next? Did you want to put the ornaments on the tree? She asked. I bought some from the hardware store, he said. Didn't want to use Opal's old glass ornaments since those might be worth a lot. Wouldn't forgive myself if I broke them my first Christmas without her. Without hesitating, Blair reached out and placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. You know she was lucky to have you. He cleared his throat, trying to look as unaffected as possible. No point in showing how much her sympathy meant to him. It would just make for an awkward moment. And after their argument the other night, it was probably best to avoid those. Other way around. I was lucky to have her for as long as I did. Blair gave him a tiny, encouraging smile. It's good to remember her. Yeah, he cleared his throat again. Anyway, I've got the ornaments in some boxes out front. Coulson let the sentence trail off so that he could give her a polite nod to excuse himself and head to the foyer. He retrieved some of the boxes stacked against the wall, then went back into the living room. There's still a few boxes out there, he told her. Okay, I can start putting up the ornaments while you get the rest, she offered. Bigger ornaments at the bottom and smaller ones at the top. How does that sound? Great. Coulson gave her a thumbs up and immediately felt like a complete idiot. He hadn't actually managed to be his usual smooth-talking self with her, but at least he'd been able to act relatively normal around her lately. But there was something intimate about tree decorating that he hadn't anticipated. Not only was it making Blair happy, decorating seemed to be bringing them closer together. While she revealed her Christmas traditions, he had let his guard down long enough to start talking about his family. They were both sharing parts of themselves as they did this, and that was definitely a surprise to him. Still, he had to remember that this was only temporary. Having Blair at the mansion again was always going to stir up some feelings for him. He'd be rid of this crush by the end of the holidays. Keep telling yourself that, pal, a sarcastic voice in his head taunted. Coulson shoved the thought aside and headed back out to the foyer to get the rest of the stuff he'd purchased to decorate, including a few bushes of mistletoe. When he got back into the living room, he found Blair was already busy decorating the tree. Probably a good idea to keep some distance between them while his feelings for her were still raging. He put the boxes down, then took some of the mistletoe before striding up to the living room's doorway. There was already a hook above the doorway, so he could hang the mistletoe up without problems. Blair suddenly appeared beside him. Coulson, I was wondering if you had a pair of scissors. Her mouth fell open as she stared up at the mistletoe above them. Yeah, there's some scissors on the table out front, he said, watching for her next reaction. He knew she hated mistletoe, but he'd noticed the hook above the doorway after she'd rushed off the other night, and he'd suspected that was what the hook was for. He couldn't just ignore it, could he? What the heck is that? She demanded, her eyes landing on the mistletoe he had attached to the hook over the doorway. What does it look like? Probably a dick move on his part to antagonize her, but he couldn't help it. He liked their charged banter, mostly because he enjoyed anticipating what she would say or do next. She crossed her arms and frowned. You're seriously putting that up? It's my house, Blair. I can decorate it how I want, he said. Oh, those were fighting words. Unfortunately, she didn't have a leg to stand on because Coulson was right. This was his house, and she had zero say in what he did with the place. Frustration spiraled through her. I'm going to go get the scissors. She held up her hands over her head and ducked out of the living room, rushing away from the mistletoe. Blair wasn't going to stand under the cursed plant, especially not with Coulson so close by. Getting caught under the mistletoe with him was just going to be a recipe for disaster, a temptation even she would find impossible to resist. Her hatred of the tradition wasn't going to win against that firm mouth. Not now that he had that ridiculously arrogant grin on his face. Knowing him, he'd put the mistletoe up just to annoy her, or to tempt her. Either way, she was determined to resist. Once Blair picked the scissors off the table, she scurried back into the living room, moving as fast as she could to avoid the mistletoe in the doorway. Coulson was now standing by the tree, inspecting the Santa-shaped ornaments she had already put up. He glanced over at her, and her heart skidded to a stop when their eyes met. Heat crept up her face as she thought of the mistletoe in the doorway. Her mouth was too dry to speak, so she grabbed one of the plastic boxes that she'd found so hard to get open with her hands and busied herself cutting into the plastic. When the ornaments were free, she skirted around his muscular frame to continue decorating. Having him so close to her was distracting. She caught the hint of his aftershave, a stimulating mix of pine and menthol, and she suddenly felt lightheaded. It was torture standing so near him without being able to do anything about her desire, but luckily, he gave her a nod and started to move away from the tree. No doubt he was planning to wreak more havoc with the rest of the mistletoe. As he moved to the nearby fireplace to start decorating, she got to work with the tree. Despite his lack of experience, Coulson had picked out some pretty good ornaments. A lot of them were shaped like snowmen, reindeer, or teddy bears wearing scarves, more in line with his personality than hers, since she was partial to objects like stars, apples, holly, and candy canes. But she liked what he'd chosen. There was something boyish and charming about the ornaments he'd picked. Ordinarily, Blair would have convinced him to come help her out with the tree, but it was probably smart to keep each other at arm's length, especially with the mistletoe literally hanging over them. Now that he'd put it up, that was all she could think about. What would it be like to get the chance to kiss him? The way she was sure that countless women must have. Just thinking about her mouth on his set hers on fire. A single week of pent-up yearning for him threatened to damage her resolve. Wanting him was one thing. Acting on it was another, and she could feel herself on the verge of accidentally doing something stupid. But she couldn't dare. There was too much at stake, her professional reputation being most important. Not only were they total opposites, but he was also a client. Plus, he lived in Boston, too far away for her to entertain the idea of starting anything with him. There was no use fighting against the inner turmoil, so she focused her attention on the task in front of her, decorating the tree. As she got to work putting up the ornaments, she was vaguely aware of him hanging up garlands around the living room. They worked on decorating in relative silence for about 20 minutes. Finally, when she noticed that she had emptied half of the ornament boxes, she decided to pause for a break. Blair saw that he was by the window, and against all common sense, she felt slightly giddy at the opportunity to talk to him. But then her mouth fell open when she realized what she was doing. Blair marched up to him, her hands on her hips. More mistletoe? Coulson was literally holding a bush of mistletoe over his head, as if he was prepared to hang it up above the window. Worse, there was a window seat below, so it was clearly a smart place to put it. That was going to make it hard to argue against. Yes, Blair, more mistletoe, he said, not even bothering to look at her. He was so arrogant. He was the one who'd asked for her help decorating, and now he wasn't even interested in listening to her advice. The living room looked better without the mistletoe, and she'd swear on a stack of Bibles that particular opinion had nothing to do with the custom she found so irritating. She tapped her foot in frustration. Do you really think that's the sort of decoration that the living room needs? I mean, it's like you said. You're the only one in the house at the moment, so there really is no point. It wouldn't serve a purpose. I'm not the only one in the house. This time, he did look at her, his impossibly green eyes fixing her in place as he stared down his nose in her direction. You're here. She shivered as the meaning of his words dawned on her. Despite his dismissal of her concerns about the mistletoe, his mind had been going to the exact same place that hers had. Yes, I am here, she stammered, barely able to form a coherent sentence. Her heart started pounding as she desperately grasped for what to say next. Have you actually taken part in this tradition, Blair? He questioned, his tone deceptively bland. Kind of ashamed to miss out on the experience. How can you hate something if you've never even tried it? I have tried it, she bit out sharply, too quickly to stop herself from answering. The truth was, she had kissed a few guys under the mistletoe, back when she was in high school, and had a mouthful of braces, but she had been dodging holiday kisses all her adult life. It was a tradition for hormonal teenagers, not level-headed adults. Several times. Hopefully that would deter him from badgering her any further. Ah, well, I haven't, he said, his breath ruffling her hair away from her face as he spoke. Blair shivered again, a thrill going down her spine. Oh, she was starting to realize her mistake, because she'd momentarily forgotten that he was clever and had a way with words. He was too slick by half, smooth talking, and he'd talked her into quite a few things since he'd arrived. That wasn't even the worst of it. Not only was she standing underneath the mistletoe that he held over their heads, Blair couldn't move. Her legs wouldn't let her. Even if she actually wanted to get away, it wouldn't have made a difference because she felt utterly helpless to her own desire. Too overcome with need to run off like she had the last time she'd made the mistake a mere half-hour earlier. That was when she heard the most unexpected sound. Laughter. Coulson was laughing. A low chuckle that signaled his amusement. He shook his head, flashing her a lopsided boyish grin that made her stomach do somersaults. Her heart started to beat even faster, anticipation making her entire body shake. She could scarcely get air into her lungs as she stared up at him. Their eyes locked. The air around them suddenly felt charged with heated electricity. If she took so much as a deep breath, she'd be close enough to kiss him. You should see the look on your face, he said, teasing her gently. She felt the cold splash of disappointment. Blair knew what that tone meant. Coulson wasn't going to kiss her after all. He'd been joking. Of course he didn't want to kiss her. While she sensed his attraction to her, she could guess that his feelings weren't nearly as strong as hers. She was just a passing fancy for him, a mild interest over the holidays, more than likely a way to stave off boredom and pass the time until he went back to the city where he could be with the type of women he really wanted. And then, suddenly, he leaned in closer to press a kiss to the corner of her mouth. A kiss so chaste she might have missed it if it weren't for the warmth of his firm lips on her skin. He was chuckling again, and she knew that the kiss was closer to a gotcha than anything, and yet she still felt the pressure of the kiss even as he pulled away, the brush of his 5 o'clock shadow caressing her with the movement. Oh, the feeling of his stubbled jaw brushing against hers was almost too much. The welcome scent of pine and mint enveloped her. She shivered as the one bit of masculinity overwhelmed her senses. Her blood started to simmer as the rest of her body caught up with what had just transpired. Now, was that so bad? He asked. Not so bad was an understatement. Blair's mind was still reeling from their brief contact. Her knees wobbled, and she had to brace her hand against the window to keep from falling over. No, it wasn't, she admitted. Back to work, then? He smiled, turning his attention to the partially decorated tree. As he paused to look at her work, Blair realized that he was totally oblivious to the effect he had on her. It was different for Blair as she tried to remember how to breathe. That momentary kiss had only lasted a few seconds, but her body would be humming for hours because of it. Parts of her still tingled from their shared contact, from the scent of his aftershave. Yes, Back to work, she breathed out. Looks good so far, he said, reaching for one of the ornament boxes. Small ones at the top, right? She nodded, moving on shaky legs to join him by the tree. Right. Without another word, they got to work putting various ornaments up. The silence in the wake of that kiss was setting her on edge. It wasn't rational, but as she decorated alongside him, she worried that the living room was so quiet he could hear her heartbeat, or worse, hear her thoughts, because her entire body was trembling from the onslaught of her emotions. Her mind wouldn't stop spinning. There was no way he couldn't tell that something had shifted in her. Clearing her throat, she decided to be the one to start talking again. So, for Christmas, do you want presents under the tree or in stockings? What does your family do? He asked. When we were kids, Santa put presents in stockings for me and my brothers, she answered. But of course, my parents took over, so they started putting gifts under our tree when we grew out of trying to stay awake for Santa. She paused when she remembered that his parents had never given him the opportunity to look forward to gifts from Santa. To her, it seemed so harsh, taking away a kid's sense of wonder around the holidays. Her heart clenched a little for him. You don't talk about your parents much, he observed. They got divorced, she said softly. Their split was amicable compared to a lot of other divorces, but it was still pretty traumatic. How old were you when they got divorced? She sighed heavily. 15. I had to adjust to going back and forth between houses for Christmas. That's a lot to ask a kid, he said. Yes, she said with a nod. But my mom got a job that required her to move around a lot, so I spend Christmas at Dad's house now. Anyway, now that we're older, we either exchange presents or put them under the tree at Dad's place. Honestly, I wasn't expecting presents this year, he said. I'll get you a gift, she offered, suddenly excited at the prospect. What? I haven't done anything to earn a gift from you, he said. Oh, come on, Coulson. You said we were friends, right? Right, he said, with a quick nod of acknowledgement. Friends exchange gifts, she pointed out. Well, if receiving a gift from you means that I get to buy one for you as well, then, he smiled at her, I accept. Nothing expensive, she cautioned. He opened his mouth to protest, but she held up her hand. I'm serious, she said. You can forget about spending another $1,000 like it's nothing. $40 or less. 100, he countered. She frowned, narrowing her eyes at him. This isn't a boardroom. You can't negotiate the price of Christmas gifts. Says who? He demanded. It's against the spirit of it. Gift giving is about generosity. $100 seems pretty generous to me, he interrupted. Okay, you know what? We don't have to tell each other how much the gift costs, she said, realizing that if she didn't put her foot down, he'd just steamroll right over her with that charm of his. Just keep it reasonable. His smile widened and she noticed a glint in his eye. I mean it, she said firmly. The glint didn't disappear. If you say so. He was impossible. She just prayed he would follow instructions. The gift can go under the tree, he added. Great. Finally, they finished decorating the living room and everything looked beautiful. Traditional, festive, complete with cheerful lights, well-placed garlands, some well-placed glittery pine cones, and the perfect Christmas tree. Looks like we're done, she observed as he placed the final ornament, a happy angel, at the top of the tree. Anything else? There's a wreath I wanted to put out on the front door, he said. It's out front. I can help, she volunteered, walking with him across the living room. When they got to the entrance, Blair remembered the mistletoe and stopped in her tracks. This was an opportunity to turn the tables on him. He'd been teasing her about her dislike of the tradition and even managed to make a chaste kiss into something unforgettable. Well, two could play that game. She reached out to take his hand and stop him. Payback time, she said with a soft laugh. Coulson arched a questioning eyebrow. Payback? Yes, she said firmly, releasing his hand so she could hold on to his shirt. Leaning closer, she pressed the faintest kiss to his lips. The touch was brief and feather-light, barely registering as a kiss, if she was being honest, but that momentary brush of lips ignited something inside her. She wanted more. More than a brief touch of lips. A lot more. Unable to help herself, she nibbled on his lower lip playfully, eliciting a groan from him. Oh, she hadn't counted on getting that kind of reaction from him at all. Shocked by her own brazenness, Blair pulled away to gauge his response. As she drew back, she glimpsed the surprise flashing in his eyes, followed immediately by a smoldering desire that stole her breath away. Nobody had ever looked at her like that before, with raw, primal need. Coulson wanted her. He pulled her close, their lips locking. Barely suppressing a sigh, she tipped her head back, angling her mouth against his to give him better access. The pressure of his mouth was insistent this time, demanding. Her lips parted ever so slightly in response, and, seizing his chance, he stormed her mouth with his tongue. Heat surged through her. She closed her eyes, and yet she saw a burst of stars. Coulson tasted like 1 part heaven, 2 parts sin. Sweet, bold, and decadent. With that realization, her mind started to swim, the kiss intoxicating her. Blair's mind was spinning. She felt like she was going to float away. Desperate for an anchor, she wrapped her arms around his broad shoulders, clutching him. His wicked mouth crushed hers as the kiss turned into pure hunger. He swirled his tongue into her mouth, and her knees almost buckled. Sensing that her balance was shaky, he wrapped his arms around her, drawing her so close that she felt every line of his hard body. She arched against him, suddenly feeling that telltale sign of his desire. Blair could feel his hard length through the layers of clothes separating them, and heat spiraled through her. She whimpered softly. Everything was frenzied now, as if both of them were afraid it would abruptly end, as if Coulson wanted to drink his fill of her before it was too late. The place between her legs throbbed. Their tongues collided again and again as he explored her with his skillful tongue. Blair moaned, too shameless to care if he knew how much she wanted this. She was trembling in his arms. This was not what she had in mind when she first kissed him beneath the mistletoe. The tradition had infuriated her most of her life, and yet she never wanted this kiss to end. For some reason, she wanted to make this last, as if to make up for all the time she had avoided men's attention or any romantic attachments. Yes, that was what this kiss was. Blair was making up for lost time.